very briefly say a word about the mysterious title of this next session, which is called Pentecostalism and Spiritual Capital. Now, many of you know of economic capital and human capital and social capital. What in the world is spiritual capital? We have some spiritual capital experiences in the back of the room. They're not as dynamic, I know, seated, but our speakers are really appreciated if you can come take your seats. A few years ago, some of you are familiar with the work of a Harvard political scientist named Robert Putnam, wrote a book called Bowling Alone, and he's writing about social capital and forms of trust. And one of his findings on social capital was that over 50% of it was generated from religious networks, and it was probably more than that. And to be some of his writing, I know I've heard him speak about this, that he admitted that he was a little bit surprised that so much of the sources of trust and civic engagement and things like that were from religious sources. So one initiative the foundation has already developed that I put together is on research on spiritual capital, and if you just search on Google or other places, you'll find a website that lists several projects that we've supported, including one run by Bob Woodberry and one by Peter Berger. So this is building on some existing research that we funded. So very briefly, we're defining spiritual capital as the economic, social, and political consequences of religious networks and institutions. So it's a broad tent, but there are a lot of interesting things in the tent. And to find out more what that might be, I happily turn the panel over to Peter Berger.
Well, to clarify something, must be confusion in your minds. You are under the impression that this conference is being run by the Templeton Foundation. It is not. It is run by an outfit called Time Motion Studies International in Osaka, Japan. Very strict time limits. And I've been instructed to abide by these with ferocity. So I will warn the panelists that they have to stick very closely to a 20-minute time slot, or I will use every means short of physical violence to bring them back into it. So I don't think I will spend time telling the biographies of these people, who are all eminently qualified, but they are described somewhere in your little program, so I don't have to repeat that. So we'll start with Professor Woodberry. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Given the massive spread of Pentecostalism around the world, you would think there would be a lot of research about and concern about the social impact it has, the impact it has on the economy, the impact it has on the political system, etc. But to date, there's really not a lot. It's quite very little. And much of what exists is sort of ethnographic studies of small communities or churches, or listing of statements by different Pentecostal elites. There's beginning to be some careful quantitative work, but there's still not a lot of it. And certainly if we look at the United States, we see that statements by elites do not necessarily reflect the attitudes or behaviors of ordinary Pentecostals or ordinary conservative Protestants. So much of what I'm going to talk about today has to be viewed tentatively in terms of the overall impact of Pentecostalism on political democracy. There's a substantial research, however, on Protestantism more broadly and political democracy. Certainly both in terms of historical but also in terms of the quantitative work. Even though it sounds uncomfortable to say, there is a very strong and stable association between the percent Protestant in a society and both the level of political democracy and the stability of democratic changes. However, much of that is historical. Certainly in the past 30 years or so, there's been a substantial change in the Catholic Church in terms of its relationship with political democracy, and it's been important in a number of democratic transitions in societies around the world. You've also had some opening up to democracy in other societies, such as those with historical Confucian base. So some of the distinctiveness of Protestantism is changing over time. However, in this, we're looking at Pentecostalism more specifically, and at least looking at if it has the same impact or a different impact on the spread of political democracy. There is a small amount of survey data that looks at attitudes towards political democracy in places like Argentina and Chile. In those surveys, they don't tend to be distinct in terms of their attitudes towards the positiveness of political democracy. If anything, slightly less favorable, perhaps because in those contexts it hasn't been as beneficial to them. But there's also many indirect effects which may have a positive impact on political democracy. Part of the reason for the lack of knowledge about this topic is that there are very few Pentecostal scholars, at least in the social sciences, at top programs. So because a lot of study is sort of self-study, not a lot of research has gotten done on this topic. And surveys in general have tended to ignore Pentecostalism almost entirely. If you look even in the United States, where you have a large research community that looks at religion, and a substantial Pentecostal and charismatic population, you have to search long and hard to find any surveys on which you're able to even identify Pentecostals. Internationally, the situation is worse, where there's a few cross-sectional surveys looking at one period of time in some Latin American countries. But certainly if you look at longitudinal surveys, I've only been able to find one in Malawi. Another difficulty is the recent spread of Pentecostalism. There's often a significant time lag where religious traditions can shape political institutions and political culture and other things like that. There's also a significant diversity within Pentecostalism between different types of groups. And finally, Pentecostalism has shaped the behavior of other religious groups, minimizing some of the distinctions. So you've had significant lay charismatic movements within the Catholic Church, within other quote-unquote mainline Protestant denominations. And also people who have looked at sort of the rise of liberation theology and other things like that have argued that the competition from Pentecostals was an important factor in motivating the Catholic Church to put priests working among the poor and creating the political space that allowed something like liberation theology to develop. So in that way, you have an indirect effect on the Catholic Church in terms of its relationship to activity among the poor and its political stances, which are connected to the spread of Pentecostalism. But once involved in that, the Catholic Church has a number of institutional advantages which better make it easier for it to stand up against the state in particular contexts. So next I'll look at the mechanisms through which Pentecostalism may influence political democracy. One of them is through the spread of the rule of law, minimizing corruption or lowering crime rates, things like that, which is related to the stability of democratic institutions and related to people's attitudes about the functioning of them and the fairness of how they work. Certainly on an individual level, where we have data, mostly from the United States and Europe, there's a relationship between the level of religiosity and lower involvement in crime and other things like that. Although the impact is much stronger in communities where there's high overall religiosity. So it's not just an individual effect, it's also a communal effect. Also, in areas where we have data, there's a negative association between religion and also being Protestant on acceptance for political corruption, and between religiosity and being one of the groups of conservative Protestants, such as evangelicals, Pentecostals, charismatics, and fundamentalists, and misappropriation of resources at work, things like that. Things that would suggest that there might be a relationship between something like religion and political corruption. With national level statistics, there's also a very strong and consistent relationship between the percent Protestants in society and lower levels of political corruption. And that's true with any type of measure that has currently been used. So surveys of international business people, surveys of people in the society about their perceptions of corruption, surveys of people in a country about their victimization by corruption, whether they've been asked for bribes, and also at different levels. So political corruption by judges, police, government bureaucrats, and political leaders. And there's dozens. Every study that I've seen that's put in a variable for Protestantism has found a significant result and used lots of different controls to try and remove it and not been able to. However, the relationship between religion and corruption doesn't seem to be automatic and perhaps not perpetually necessary. So certainly places like Scandinavia have had declining levels of religiosity and declining levels of identification with Protestantism and have maintained very low corruption rates. And you've had massive spread of Protestantism in many parts of the world that had high corruption rates and continue to have high corruption rates. So once you have a pattern of low corruption or high corruption, it seems to be very difficult to change. Studies of small communities that have looked at the impact of Pentecostalism have suggested that there's an impact, at least in terms of villages or towns, in terms of lower corruption or honest behavior. However, in terms of translating to a national level, there seems to have been there's a little bit of a disconnect. Certainly, many of the presidential leaders or major national figures in terms of politics have often been involved in corruption scandals of their own. Certainly Serrano and the party of Rios Montt in Guatemala, the Universal Church in Brazil, various things like that. So there seems to be a difficulty in translating from a local level to a national level. It may be the people who get involved in national politics. It may be maybe some political naivete and being used by other forces. It's not clear, but there seems to be some difficulty in getting that to a national level. However, we should have realistic expectations. Not much else has worked at reducing political corruption at society levels either. I mean, there's been international programs from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, etc., as well as other religious groups in early involvement in politics have also gotten involved in often many questionable things. Another mechanism is through voluntarism or civil society. There's a whole research from Putnam and others about the importance of organizations outside state control in terms of limiting state power and providing conditions where democracy can thrive. There's an important impact of religious groups in forming organizations outside state control. Some of this, I think, is causal. Certainly, religious groups that are independent of state financing have to instill the habit of charity and voluntarism in their congregants in order to survive. And they develop skills in organizing religious groups, in organizing revivals that can be used for other forms of civic organization. And so where we have statistical evidence, people who are more religiously active and Protestants also tend to give more and volunteer more time, both for religious and non-religious organizations. How do Pentecostals relate to this? Well, certainly they are voluntary religious organizations that would instill similar types of skills in terms of voluntarism and charity. There's very little quantitative work that's differentiated them, so it's difficult to compare them with other non-state religious groups. A non-random survey in South Africa suggests that Pentecostals give more than mainline Protestants and other religious groups in South Africa, blacks. But it's a non-random survey. And Pentecostalism seems also to have been able to spread where other religious traditions have not, among poor people in areas with a great deal of oppression of religious groups. And it seems partially because they're able to mobilize lay leaders quickly and easily, where you don't have to go away to a seminary necessarily to become a religious leader. You need the gifts of the Spirit, and you need to be able to organize and lead people. So it's been able to spread a form of civil society in areas where other groups have not been nearly as successful at doing it. However, in some cases, in terms of at least the transition to political democracy, Pentecostal groups have not been as active in criticizing dictators or trying to pressure for the transition to political democracy. However, I think much of this has to do with differences in resources and information. If you're the Catholic Church, for example, and a bishop makes a statement against a particular dictator, it's very difficult for that dictator to arrange for the disappearance of that bishop, because there's an international network of organization which gives protection to the bishop and can put significant pressure on the person. There's also inside information, so interviews with pastors in, like, for example, Ghana that were involved in criticizing abuses by Kwame Nkrumah and others suggested that they had inside information because they trained a lot of the senior bureaucrats in their school, which helped them to know when they couldn't speak or not. Another factor is the impact of education. There's a literature on the impact of education on political democracy, on the level and the stability of transitions. Religion has been important in spurring the supply of formal education, particularly non-state Protestantism, because of the belief that people should read the Bible in their own language. Pentecostalism has tended to become late in the movement and has not been influential in terms of creating new schools, at least although they have done some. And where other religious groups and the state have started to become involved in the provision of education, their role is less unique in terms of something like creating schools. Historically, states didn't think they should do education, but currently they do. But that's partially a secularization of a religious motivation. In terms of demand for education, again, Pentecostals are rarely differentiated. There seems to be a difference in terms of where people are located. So in the United States, although highly religious people tend to get more education on average, although few of them seem to get in academia, at least in the social sciences. Conservative Protestants, including Pentecostals, tend to be less educated than other religious groups. In the global south and in the poor, there seems to be a moderate positive impact on the children of Pentecostals in terms of getting education. Not all of this is just a selection effect. So, for example, surveys in Taiwan, you can show that Protestants, regardless of their own education level and class background, have higher educational expectations of their children, both for male and female. However, surveys in Central America by Steiginga show that Pentecostals have less education than other historic Protestants and Mormons, although some of that may be due with class. And a non-random survey in South Africa suggests that among blacks, they have higher educational expectations. Because Pentecostalism has been able to spread so broadly, much broader than many of the smaller historic Protestant denominations like Presbyterianism, you may have an overall impact on education that's greater in terms of a large amount of moderate increases of education as opposed to a small amount of strong increases of education that might happen through a group such as Presbyterians. So the overall impact is not clear. Another factor is in terms of economic development. Again, there's a literature on economic development and the stability of democratic transitions and an importance of the rise of the middle class. Most research suggests that there's a modest positive impact on the economic situation of poor Pentecostals. They seem to help people who are in very marginal situations get into a less marginal situation. However, there does not seem to be an impact in moving people into the highly wealthy categories, the elite. Certainly in the United States, where we have good statistical evidence, Pentecostals and other conservative Protestants are likely to marry early, have children earlier, and then thus take less financial risks, take less risks in terms of their jobs. And so the economic trajectory relative to Jews and some other groups, you can see a differentiating pattern over time, even from the same class background, with people who marry later and have children later and do more risky investments and job changes, doing substantially better in later life in terms of their economic situation. Another mechanism is in terms of the spread of either violence or intolerance, which is often associated with religious traditions. It doesn't seem that there's much of an impact here in terms of Pentecost. There's been violence against conversion to Pentecostalism, but not much violence in terms of people leaving Pentecostalism. There's talk of Christian nation issues, but it hasn't tended to lead to legal restrictions of other religious groups, and has forced other religious groups to open up situations and remove some of the restrictions on religious groups, thus fostering the twin tolerations that is important in terms of state not restricting religion and religion not controlling the state. So overall, even though the evidence is still not strong, there seems to be a moderate positive influence indirectly through how it shapes institutions in society and other religious groups, and mobilizing new religious groups who have not been politically organized or represented in the past. However, it doesn't seem to have a massive transformative power in terms of political democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Woodberry. I'm recommending you for the Sayonara Prize of Time Motion Discipline. You've shown a shining example for the other panelists. Look, unless the panel objects, what I would suggest is that we have the three presentations and then have a discussion period for whatever time is left. So, Professor Kalu.
My paper is entitled Sankofa, Pentecostalism and African Cultural Heritage. The goal of the paper is to explain the rapid growth of African Pentecostalism. And 4 discourses have been used. One is the historical, the other is the instrumentalist, the third is the religious, and I'm going to deal with the cultural discourse. The historical tries to root modern African Pentecostalism into the precedents. For instance, if I were just to take out from what we heard this morning, we heard that 25 missionaries from Azusa Street went to Africa. Now, if you use the statistics, you'll think that Pentecostalism in Africa was started from Azusa Street, when that is not true. Because 25 missionaries from Azusa Street in the whole of the continent of Africa is less than a drop in the ocean. And when we look at the details, we find that Harris was not from a Pentecostal group from Azusa Street. And so the historical discourse helps us to restart the whole debate and put the African data forward to see how Pentecostalism came, how holiness movements were already operating there, how many of the classical Pentecostals were invited by indigenous Africans, and how, as Alan said, Africans actually carried the brunt of the mission. So that's what historical discourse does. It's not what I'm going to go into now. Then instrumentalist discourse, is, in fact, ties up with the religious capital issue, namely the predominance of social sciences in discussing African Pentecostalism and using deprivation theories. People are jumping into Pentecostalism because they are poor, because the economy collapsed, because of legitimacy crisis, a whole number of social science data. The religious discourse tries to show that essentially Pentecostalism is a Christian movement, and therefore their message matters, their theology matters, what they are saying to people, how their presence in communities matter. What I'm discussing today is the cultural discourse, which says that the growth of Pentecostalism in Africa is related to its fit into the worldview. And some approach the historical discourse from social sciences, while others approach it from theology. What I've tried to do here is to combine both. That is, I'm doing a church history which is at the interface of history and theology. because location matters. Many of the studies that we've seen tend to deal with contemporary urban Africa, where most of Africans live in the rural areas. So we need to shift the location and be able to see both rural and urban manifestations of Pentecostalism. And therefore, we use a concept which we call three publics. Three publics is basically saying that when you look at any African community, you are going to see three publics. One, the indigenous public. Two, the Western public, which has impined through and maintained through education, through multinational corporations, and an emergent public where the two, which is neither Western nor indigenous. In fact, this is the type which has been described by urban-rural migration, which somebody said, in fact, for Africa, you should be talking about secularity, because many people come into the town, and as soon as they arrive there, they are preparing about their return and retirement back to their villages. And secondly, we find that indigenous values are very important in the modern emergent public. That is why what we call the villagization of the public modern space. Many people are carrying charms from their villages and having titles from their villages so as to be able to operate in the modern contemporary scene. And so the village idiom is still very important. Now, I entitled this paper Sankofa. Sankofa is a bird in a Chui language in Ghana, and this bird is looking backwards. And so it's now a symbol of recovering your heritage. Come back and take it. And I want to use it in discussing a particular issue in African Pentecostalism, namely Pentecostal response to the African past. I want to use four scholars, basically, in this analysis. One is Bridget Meyer, who has promoted this notion of Pentecostalism and making a complete break and using the symbol of the devil. The second is David Maxwell, who has worked among the Shona in Zimbabwe, and Rick Van Dyck, who has worked on Malawi. Then I will use Ben Jones as a counter. These people have argued that Pentecostals create a new moral compass. And in this new moral compass, they embody symbols of resistance. They build moral boundaries against the past. They create skepticism and critique of the past. And they make the past to become a morally suspect category, and therefore employ certain solutions which have been differently called deliverance ministry, witchcraft eradication or cleansing, redeeming the land, and exorcism. Ben Jones turns the argument around and says that if you look at the rural areas, you will find that much to the contrary, the Pentecostals fit into the rural compass, the worldview, and are in fact given some role in governance precisely because people consider them as more honest individuals, so that there's not that break. But I'm going forward to say that the relationship between Pentecostals and the indigenous African past is more complex. For instance, Bridget Meyer herself agrees that, in fact, Pentecostals are using the idiom which reflects the impact of missionary legacy and tradition. And we find that in Christianity, that this notion of the devil has always been there. Pentecostals did not invent them. And secondly, if we turned around and use a history of religion approach, we'll find continuity between Pentecostalism and African indigenous religions. And this is an area which has attracted attention and which, in fact, we need to look at more consistently, because it helps us to understand how Pentecostals begin to contest the indigenous religions, and not by using the old missionary method, but by moving into the idiom of the indigenous traditions and utilizing them. So what we find the Pentecostals are doing is that, one, they accept the reality of indigenous religious worldviews, and then begin to speak prophetically into it, bringing a power encounter, bringing a different power, not rejecting it, but valorizing it, but in a different direction. And we see that what they are doing is far more threatening to the indigenous religions, because the guardians now go into worldview maintenance and attack the Pentecostals, because they see what the Pentecostals are doing is more like a virus effect, that they are more, since they are not declaring that this is superstition. But in fact, if you come to a Pentecostal minister and said that you were hearing voices, he doesn't send you to Chicago hospitals to be given some medicine to sedate you. He says, yes, I know where this is coming from. We'll pray with you and deliver you from this. This type of attitude is what I'm saying he has actually created a stronger challenge. Because some scholars argue that Pentecostalism merely valorized changes that indigenous religious movements had initiated. All parties are engaged in worldview maintenance with competing narratives. This explains why cultural tradition often attacks this new religious form as an invasive virus. Others emphasize how Pentecostalism engages the resources of African indigenous cultures in pursuit of its own agenda. They draw attention to large areas of resonance and, in fact, give the impression that Pentecostalism is actually engaged in a new era of witchcraft eradication, possession, dealing with the same spiritual forces that had been important at the beginning. I then turned the question around again and used another method. I come at it at another method. And I argue that Pentecostalism has benefited from the nationalist historiography on Christianity and the African past, especially the importance of translation. That, in fact, is vernacularization which actually created the whole opportunity to re-understand the continuity between African Christianity and African traditional religion, as Andrew Walls normally argues. And that what is happening here is actually not enculturation, but a different form in which as you take the tradition that comes to you, critique it, and then repackage it. Then I move into the interface between theology and history, and church history, to say that the Pentecostals now use certain theological understanding and interpretation of African cultures. For instance, the covenant idea. The covenant idea is just borrowed from the Bible. Since God made covenants with Israel, they argue that in this worldview, the cyclical perception of time and three-dimensional perception of space, which is a very charismatic worldview with spirits at all levels, that Africans make covenants with the deities in the sky, on the land, in water, and in the ancestral world. And the nature of covenant is that they are legally binding, that they are not, you cannot just opt out. You are involved in it, and that's it. For instance, in a study that we did using the whole of Igbo land with about 20 million, we broke Igbo land into subculture areas, and then looked at the different deities, just did a sample of 615 deities, and how they are located. And we are saying that if you want to do any missionary work in any of this area, and this is what Pentecostals call spiritual mapping, you have to look at, for instance, which are the 3 most prominent deities in each culture area. And this will explain why different culture areas respond differently to the Christian message. So if you do a spiritual mapping by doing a survey of the deities, then you see the covenant patterns. And therefore you can attack the spirits which are most prominent at the gates of those communities. And that unless you deal with that, you'll find your Christianity sitting like oil and water. So the covenant idea now gives us a means of looking at Pentecostal response to the African heritage. Then we now shift again and look at the resonance and kindred spirit and atmosphere between the Bible and African worldview. That, for instance, the myth of creation, the 3-dimensional perception of time are the same. And that this is just as charismatic. And here you find a precarious vision in which human beings use the resources of some gods to protect them from others and to be able to achieve life's goals. And that words are powerful. Blood is powerful. There are a whole number of resonances which you can find between the biblical worldview and the African worldview. And that's what the Pentecostal does. Pentecostal hermeneutics, Pentecostal homiletics are really built on utilizing those pathways, those resonances between African worldview and the biblical worldview. Then the paper therefore moves on to describe the African worldview. We are saying that in spite of different worldviews in Africa, that there is a structure, and that structure it can be applied everywhere. And so by understanding this structure, describing the details, we are able to understand how the Pentecostal utilizes the worldview. And then we begin to conclude what we call swallowing the magician's serpent. That when Moses encountered the magicians in the house of Pharaoh, the narrative pointed to the undeniable fact that the magicians were able to produce serpents. They had and exercised powers, but the serpent produced by Moses swallowed the others to indicate that his rod of authority was more powerful. This informs the attitude of Pentecostals to African traditional cultures and religions. Unlike the enlightened missionary cultural policy, Pentecostals accept the power and reality in the symbols and rituals of communities and bring a pneumatic knowing to respond. Just as the primal societies wove covenants and encapsulating strategies to maintain cosmic order, Pentecostals essay to reshape the covenants, worldview, social control models, and individual life journeys and goals so that individuals and communities will have a better life. They reshape the community's sense of order. These strategies could be illustrated with cultural ingredients from the domestic and social domains, from arts and aesthetics, religious life and public space, and especially with communication, the use of symbols, speech, and media to construct a new reality. The vibrancy and efficacy of the combined force of these strategies have given the new movement a high profile. The movement can best be understood within the strand in African church historiography, which has urged attention on the weave between religious ecology and the forms of Christian allegiance. It is a response to the deep-level challenges of the eco-theater, applying the pneumatic resources of biblical theology, which missionary theology and practice had muted. Working within African maps of the universe, They have shown how a creative use of biblical promises can transform the lives of many with tools of hope in the midst of the darkness which has hit Africa at noontide. They have exploited the elasticity in African worldview, its capacity to make room within its inherited body of traditions for new realities, which those seemingly from outside come in to fulfill aspirations within the tradition, and then to offer quite significantly the basis of self-understanding within the tradition. Kwame Bediako said that this is what Paul did with Jewish traditions in the letter to the Hebrews. That is, if he wrote it. Pentecostals have fleshed out their faith in the context of contending religious and social forces in Africa. The use of external cultural resources to create an emergent culture started with Western encounter with Africans. The genius of this movement lies in the degree of cultural creativity in appropriating, gestating, and reconstructing the extravenous with fresh imagination and energy. Culture and race were the contested set of signifiers in action in colonial Christianity, and African Christianity was stamped with values of anti-structure from the onset. Pentecostalism has produced a culture of continuity by mining primal worldview, reproducing an identifiable character, and regaining a pneumatic and charismatic religiosity as existed in traditional society. In conclusion, the achievement of Pentecostals lie in their innovative responses to the challenges embedded in the African map of the universe. Thank you.
Well, if I were here as a judge, I would now have to recuse myself because the project that Ann Bernstein is reporting about is sponsored by our research center at Boston University. But I'm here not as a judge, but as a timekeeper, so I think I can stay in place. Ann?
Well, thank you very much. South Africa is a country with well over 90% of the population being Christian, but in which its public debates, its politics, are influenced hardly at all by discussions of religion or the impact of religion on society or the potential role that religion might play. Now, I run a public policy think tank in South Africa, and within this context, and until very recently, would have been one of those very many South African chattering heads who thinks about the development challenges we face without thinking about religion at all. And then I met Peter Berger. The research project we've just completed is an exploration, a very exploratory project looking at Pentecostalism and its potential economic and political impact in South Africa. And we've yet to pull all this together. So what I'm going to say today are my initial impressions and tentative ideas. Now, the South African president earlier this year, supported by his finance minister, declared South Africa to be entering an age of hope. They were referring to this in an economic sense, as we are experiencing our longest run of economic growth in the last 20, 25 years. But I've been struck in looking at Pentecostalism in the country by the message of hope being preached by Pentecostal pastors and reported back by the very many hundreds of interviews that our researchers have done among congregants. And I think this hope is particularly striking when you consider the environment in which many African Pentecostals live. They exist in communities wrestling with very violent crime, extraordinarily high levels of unemployment, a wide range of difficult social challenges, dysfunctional families, teenage pregnancy, the abuse of women, HIV/AIDS, just to name a few of these. In this context, the message of hope is all the more remarkable and potentially interesting in terms of its unintended consequences for individuals and the communities involved. Let me raise some of the issues that have struck me as a novice outsider to this world and somebody who thinks about public policy a great deal. I know there's a lot of debate about categorization and the statistics, but at one measure, you can say that the growth of Pentecostals is occurring very rapidly in South Africa today. The members of South African Pentecostal, Apostolic Faith Mission, and other Christians, as defined in our census, i.e. unaffiliated churches, has risen from 4.6 million in 1996 to some 6.8 million in 2001. At the same time, traditional mainline Christian churches saw no growth at all in their numbers. Now, if this some 8% annual growth rate is sustained, the number of South African Pentecostals, as defined, will reach almost 50 by the year 2011, around about 30% of the population as projected at that time. Now, as in many other countries, Pentecostal churches take many forms in South Africa, from the large mega-church phenomenon, often in formerly so-called white suburbs, to smaller churches in inner cities, in South African townships, and informal settlements in very, very poor areas. Now, the country is one of those developing countries that has a very low rate of entrepreneurship, and we do not score well in many of the tables of entrepreneurship across the globe. What struck me most profoundly is that Pentecostal pastors are actually a very entrepreneurial bunch of people. They go out into difficult circumstances, they look for a niche, and they start to build their congregation. If they do well, their lives certainly improve, and one presumes their congregants as well. So, one area in which this growth of this religious activity is really interesting is that it's provided an avenue for entrepreneurs that have been denied those opportunities in other areas. And I think that is a missing spirit that is not talked about in our society. They're very modern in their attitudes. We recently held a workshop and a number of pastors came to join the academics in reality testing. And we were intrigued when Professor James Hunter of the University of Virginia asked some of the pastors, well, none of you have really mentioned the issue of sin very much. How do you deal with this in your communities? It was a rather difficult silence, and eventually one of the pastors said, well, and he smiled, I get visiting evangelists to deal with that issue. And then after we had all reacted, he said, and then I come in and I smooth things over. Don't really want to lose too many congregants, you know. So it's a very modern approach to subcontracting difficult issues, rather like a management consultant, which I thought was quite interesting. Now, in the last 12 years, South Africa has, in its desire to deal with some of the legacy of apartheid and deal with the tremendous poverty facing many people, it has, unfortunately, in my view, built a very large welfare state. And very many South Africans depend on government grants. And there is also a sort of notion of the government must deliver. The African National Congress will deliver development and services. And the government itself has now realized that unintendedly it's created an attitude of people sitting back and saying, well, where are you? Deliver already. Why haven't you brought this, that, and the next thing to me and my community? And it's in that context that I found the message coming through from very many of these churches and the pastors is all about agency. It's about how individuals can take control of their own lives and can through their religious beliefs, with their religious beliefs, start to improve their circumstances in quite dramatic ways. And in the context of apartheid and what that did to black South Africans, this is a very important message, it seems to me, that's being delivered through these religious institutions. Because of apartheid and a number of other reasons, the country is very short of skills. These are the most basic lifestyle skills to the most basic work skills of how to behave in a work environment to much more sophisticated skills. And here again, the reports coming back from our research of the Pentecostal churches acting as little agencies for skills development at a pretty basic level in running their own administration, in learning how to get on with each other, in building an institution, as well as the skills of how to look for a job, or at a more sophisticated level, how to start an enterprise. And these are very important, essential skills that we lack. So another interesting area. Now, South Africans don't save enough. And I was intrigued when I attended the Sunday morning service at a very big mega church, the Rima Church in a former white suburb, 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, some 3,500 people, of which at most, I would say 5 to 8% were white South Africans. I was interested that in response to the sermon that day, the loudest reaction from the congregation was the pastor was talking about the obstacles that people face in their lives, and that he too had obstacles, and that with the Lord's help that people could overcome these obstacles. The loudest reaction was when he said, "And we can all get out of debt," which I thought was a very revealing response in the context of great aspiration in South Africa among newly empowered black South Africans to acquire all the goodies that many of us take for granted. And in this context, one of the very interesting themes for me coming out of the research across the country was how people describe the impact of tithing on their lives. Now, as an outsider, one often hears rather rude remarks about this concept and the impact it has on very poor people and pastors. But in this context, I think what came through to me was how many people said that they initially didn't want to tithe. They were too poor. It was too difficult. And then they decided that they should as a part of their commitment and their beliefs. And that, strangely enough, they then found that they had to manage their own money better than before, because now they had even less money than previously if they were going to fulfill this commitment to the church, and that they had become more responsible with their own limited resources. South Africa is one of the most urbanized, industrialized countries in Africa, but nonetheless we are still urbanizing at a fairly rapid rate. And one of the phenomena that's come through from the research is the potential conclusion that what's happening is that the African independent churches tend to be the church of those people who are very new in the city, least established in the city, and that part of the break towards Pentecostalism comes as people get more established or aspire to be a more urban, possibly urbane individual. And that one of the consequences or issues in African culture has been when people start to do well, often in urban areas, it's very hard for them to start accumulating and building a middle-class lifestyle, because so many relatives or people from their village hear about this and they descend on this individual asking for favors and help and sustenance in many ways. And it seems that what the Pentecostals are able to do or starting to do is to break that. And they're saying, we do believe in Christian charity, but I will only help you if you change your life. I won't just give it to you on a sort of no-holds-barred basis. So it's conditional lending, if you'll forgive the reference. And that's very interesting, because it might be a way in which people who are getting new opportunities can build more nuclear family structures and start to build a more middle-class life rather than being held back. So it's a tentative thought in that direction. I thought it was interesting, Kimon Sargent last night talked about one of the areas of interest of the Templeton Foundation being competition. I was really struck by how competitive life is in the local level in this world of religious institution building. We went to visit a man in Soweto who had a congregation of about 200, and he explained to us that it used to be bigger, but one of his deacons had recently decided to take half the congregation and start a competitor church. And now I wish our politics were as competitive at the local level. But it seems to me that this is a level of direct accountability that's potentially very interesting. And if it had some spin-offs, could have wider implications in local communities throughout the country. The one thought I did have, which is merely a question, is that you're seeing a remarkable exercise of religious freedom throughout South Africa now, which is very exciting. And you see this in a number of different ways at the very sort of national level of the society and the most senior politicians, as well as in these local communities through competitive denominations and pastors setting up institutions. And I wonder if political freedoms were ever challenged in South Africa, a consideration one has always to bear in mind in the continent that I come from, and how these people might react, how these institutions might react if it started to affect them as well. Let me end then by saying that where I began, South Africa has a very secular public policy debate, and our politics, with a very tiny exception, is conducted in secular terms. People never mention religion in all the issues that I deal with, from land reform to the social fabric, to the nature of our families, to the future of the townships, or any of these kinds of issues, or how we manage the urbanization process. Religion is never raised. In fact, I can think of only one example in the past 12 years of democracy where a cabinet minister has said, and only when he was at his wit's end with his own bureaucracy, he said, well, now I'm going to ask the churches for help to do this because you're all useless. And about 18 months later, he rather bemusedly announced to the country that actually this had really worked. And now he had more people applying for child grants through the churches and with their help than he had really anticipated, and certainly than the finance minister had anticipated. But other than that example, people never talk about religion. Crime is a very big problem in South Africa, and nobody has ever mentioned the role of churches or religious institutions and how we can even think about combating the very high levels of crime. I was struck that the 4 pastors I personally met, and in a number of the research interviews, each one of the pastors said to me, crime is a big issue for my congregants. I go to the police station once a week and we have a discussion and we look at what we can do about this. I want them to tell me who are the criminals in my congregation. I want to deal with this and we can make a difference here. And I thought that was really a source of social capital in a particularly difficult area that nobody had been thinking about at all. So, in sum, this research project and the work that we've done and the thinking and discussions we've had and the people we've met has exposed me to a world of local energy, of leadership, and the promotion of some very important basic values about families, about personal conduct, that is very important and potentially significant for South Africa's development. From what little I can see, and on the basis of our research, the world of Pentecostal churches does look like the agents of modernization in a developing country. The irony of all of this is that South Africa might have considerably more social capital already in existence and in formation than any politician, policy expert, or intellectual has dreamed of. And that South Africa's President Thabo Mbeki, who has talked about and introduced the idea of an African Renaissance, might find that it takes a rather different form and shape than what he anticipated, if it actually occurs. Thanks very much.
Well, I think the three of you will have to share the Sayonara Prize. Thank you very much for being so disciplined about time. Before we open up the floor for discussion, I think I take the liberty of asking a question, really, of all three panelists. It struck me, only occurred to me after coming here, that this event commemorates 100 years since the Azusa Street revival. And only a couple of years ago there was another centennial event, namely 100 years since Max Weber published his essay on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Now, just in terms of, everything I know about Pentecostalism says both this is like what Weber talked about and some of it is not like what Weber talked about. And even the three presentations here showed up, it seems to me, some parallels and some not so parallel aspects as compared to an earlier form of Protestantism. Professor Woodberry's remarks on democratization and Pentecostalism remind one of de Tocqueville, of the role of Protestantism in the creation of American democracy, very much in line with what Max Weber wrote afterwards. Professor Kalu, when he talks about witchcraft, the anti-magical aspect of Pentecostalism, which is exactly what Weber meant when he talked about disenchantment of the world through Protestantism. And what Anne Bernstein talked about shows both similarities and dissimilarities. Tremendous dissimilarity. She emphasized what comes through the data, this optimism, this hopefulness, bright outlook on the world, which contrasts remarkably with the rather sour, pessimistic outlook of Puritanism. Some of this is not ascetic at all, Pentecostalism, in some respects. And in others, when Anne talked about agency and individualism, again, this is very reminiscent of Max Weber's notion of the Protestant ethic. So I think to me, one of the key questions for a social scientist is, to what extent is this global Pentecostal explosion something which is a factor promoting modern economic development? And in what respect is it not? And may there be difference in terms of places? And really I'd like to ask whoever wants to answer from the panel, how they see this in terms of the Protestant ethic concept. Any one of you?
I would say there's some overlapping and some non-overlapping. Certainly, there's some significant differences between Calvinism in the 1600s and Pentecostalism now. Possibly to the extent that economic development is related to sort of a work ethic or sort of integrity or honesty in work, there may be some parallels. At least in the research I have seen, I haven't seen maybe a comparable emphasis on education as perhaps Calvinists have had historically, and then different terms of organizational forms in terms of how the church is organized and how the church polity is functions. and possibly a different emphasis in terms of like the Calvinist idea of total depravity, or that every human action is tainted by sin, and the need to limit the influence of particular individuals, because even within the church, everything is at least tainted by sin. And so there's some distinctions, but there's also, and I also think it probably depends on the context. The Calvinists in the 1600s were in a very, very different context than people now. And certainly in the 1600s, governments didn't think that states should be involved in mass education or mass service provision or other things like that. And the idea, even though reformers didn't immediately come to the conclusion that everyone should know how to should read, they massively expanded education. And then over time, through German pietists and others, you get this idea that everyone should read, everyone should have access to the book. And it drives, and the missions movement drives the spread of mass printing. The religious conflicts drive the spread of mass printing, which is not just related to technology, because you don't see it spread in other places of the world where they knew about this. And so, but a lot of those changes have been made in terms of mass printing is available beyond circles where there's competition with Protestants. Mass education, states think that they're supposed to do that, even if many places that are poor don't have the resources to do that. There's a lower proportion of education being provided by religious groups, etc. So there's a different context, but I do think that especially among marginalized communities and in societies where the state does not function as efficiently, Pentecostal groups provide an important and major service in terms of helping people improve their economic situation, at least to a sustainable level, if not making them rich.
Let me just add briefly that in the literature, actually, there's a debate going on. Some people want to portray, and to use the African example specifically, some people want to deal with miracles and inertia, that Pentecostals, by promoting miracle, more or less create very lazy people who sit down and wait for miracles, for manna to drop from heaven. And that therefore the whole Pentecostal culture diminishes this capacity. And that but the problem with that is that it does not take full cognizance of the diversity within the movement. And others approach it by looking at prosperity preaching, the prosperity gospel, as if that is the only theology which Pentecostals purvey. And in fact, even within that theology, they don't show the varieties within. Everybody is not saying the same thing, even though it might be preaching prosperity. The other side of it is to go into Pentecostal theology and look at Pentecostal liturgy and its whole impact on the culture. What type of culture does it purvey? And then you see that there are a lot of Pentecostal preachers who motivate people to begin to use their natural resources to acquire skills, to earn the money which you are going to use in paying tithes. Because you cannot be saying that Pentecostals emphasize tithe and offering without us also seeing how they are helping people to gain this money, to get involved in the economy, artisan workshops, skills, acquisition of skills, and even the case of education. I was just pointing out to my brother here that Pentecostals are deeply implicated in the rise of Christian universities in Africa.
Well, Anne, you want to say something?
Yes, very briefly. It used to be said in South Africa that many employers would prefer to hire somebody from the Zionist Christian Church one of the largest African independent churches than anywhere else. They knew they were honest, they didn't drink, and they were reliable workers. I think the test is going to be if it starts to be the case for Pentecostals as well. And we don't know that. So that would be the one issue. The second is that I was struck by one of the pastors we met who told us about his children going to a school nearby, a private school that was also run by Pentecostals. And this was the first time I had heard of there being some Pentecostal private schools. Now, that's a research issue. We don't know enough about that. And then the last point, Peter, is that I want to come back to being struck by pastors as a group. I think this is a very interesting phenomenon in poor communities. Who are these people? The tremendous competitive and entrepreneurial drive, and they have enormous ambition. The man we were speaking to in Soweto, with a congregation of 200 people, he'd bought a piece of land, and what did he want to do with this? He wants to build an auditorium to hold 20,000 people. Now, this is an enormous push, which requires him to have a lot of congregants who are doing quite well to get him to that point. So there could be a potentially virtuous circle, but I don't feel confident to say that from the research.
Well, it looks like we're negotiating. I mean, our research center is negotiating with a Chinese government-related think tank to run a seminar in Beijing next year on religion and modernity. And these are people who are coming out of a Marxist background, but they've left their Marxism behind, and they're discovering religion. And they want to know, they've also discovered there are differences between religion. And one question that we are being asked is, on the whole, what do you think? Is Protestantism, and particularly the kind of Protestantism we are discussing in this conference, is it good for modernization? And I think our answer is going to be, with all the caveats that social scientists make to cover their rear end, I think we're going to say, yes, it is. Which is, it seems to me, a very important thing to say, not only in China, but elsewhere. Look, I think